Hey everyone, it's Taylorverse, and welcome back to us reading Sin. We are on chapter 6. Ruth. Elizabeth, I don't deserve this, Ruth. I smiled briefly back at her. I don't deserve to be so happy. From the moment I saw him, I'm sure he feels the same way, like Dante and Beatrice. I did, but see her passing by, and yet will love her till I die. You always have the right words, Ruth. Always. It's such a gift. And her radiance, the bride's radiance, caught in the long oval mirror, seemed fairy tale, unreal, as the image were such a powerful distillation of reality that finally only the image existed. I moved behind her, my deep rose dress blotted out by the folds of ivory in which Elizabeth stood. She turned suddenly. For a second we stood eye to eye, the bride and her maid of honor. She kissed me. I made no move. What should I betray? And, with the touch of Elizabeth's cool lips still seeming to flutter on my cheek, I followed her from her room to join my mother in the hall. Oh, Elizabeth, you look beautiful. Mother, Elizabeth embraced her. Mother, not true, and shortly after, father, not true either. His turn to worship. Then, steadily, past various acolytes, we made our way through Elizabeth's enchanted time to the church, and to Hubert. It is indeed a holy thing, the ritual of marriage. I looked at Hubert. His features had a kind of classic timelessness. It would ensure that any photograph of him stumbled upon in a trunk or in the corner of some room by an adolescent girl in time to come would elicit a little gasp of appreciation. That man could be so beautiful. As he turned towards Elizabeth, his face witnessed truth and love. I felt no pain. They should love each other. I searched for a word profoundly. That was satisfying to me. Its perfection challenged me. Why mar something already imperfect? It is the first crack that ruins the main, the first lie that destroys truth, the first adultery that breaks the conjunction. After that, it's only repetition. And after that, of course, it is always repetition. When perfection is defiled, it is hard to resist. It's the pleasure of destruction and the lies and the concupiscence. I've never seen that word before. What the fuck? For then the sacrifice is for nothing. So I stood, rose-colored, beside the lily, and examined quietly the tiny thorns of my bouquet. I walked behind them down the aisle, alone. The third, hooded in silk. The other rosy maidens followed us out into the low, gold summer day, which spread its slightly cloying warmth around the marble purity of the newly wedded couple. Lexington, as though drunk, seemed to dance with the rhythm of their laughter and to twinkle back at each and every smile. Long tables in the courtyard followed the shape of the house. The principal table was centered before the main building for the key actors of the tableau. Two long tables on either side followed the shape of the east and west wings of Alexa's old dynastic dream for her daughters. After lunch and speeches, people drifted dreamily down the lawns, and a few towards the greater privacy of the distant lake. They make a perfect couple, Charlotte Bathurst, Hubert's twin sister, spoke to me. Oh, yes, indeed, perfect. It was so sudden, she said. Yes. I will admit that I was a little surprised, shocked even, though Maria is thrilled. Maria always adored Elizabeth. Shocked? Why shocked? Well, she went on, they decided to marry within a month of Hubert coming to London. Then the wedding was so soon after that. Elizabeth wanted a summer wedding. There seemed no point in waiting until next summer, I replied. I disliked Charlotte Bathurst. Whereas Hubert was handsome, she had the common prettiness of the pale blue eyes and rosy lips kind. She had a soft, rather breathless way of speaking her almost accentless English. "Charlotte," I said, I wasn't at all shocked by the speed of the announcement. "They are," the word came again, "profoundly in love." "Oh, yes," she said. I saw that she did not like the idea. To a trained observer like myself, it takes the merest tightening of the muscles over the mouth to show the meanness of the soul. I kissed Charlotte briefly. I hope the kiss confused her, coming so soon after my tiny victory. I enjoyed the slight tension in her arm muscles as I held them before the predatory swoop of my lips, which was impossible for her to escape. I walked away and found another group of contented witnesses to Elizabeth's and Hubert's joy. I agreed wholeheartedly with excessive tributes to her beauty. I listened to some friends of Elizabeth's describing with seeming honesty to her endless kindness to them. And I thought of how her sudden decision to marry had turned my plan into something much more interesting, more dangerous, and more difficult. With soft smiles, I approached a hopeful Dominic, and I marveled again at what a secret thing the human heart is, and the human mind. A merciful protection for all of us. For who would survive a journey round the mind of another? No one in the world. No one knew my thoughts. God? I wondered idly. Did God know? Or knowing, care? A mathematician in love does not approach his beloved with a scientific analysis of the laws of probability of relationship, particularly a mathematician whose love is not returned. But perhaps there is a scientific law here after all. Does the love of the lover expand or contract in direct relation to the love returned or withheld? Who can fail to believe that the intensity of one's adoration, if further developed, will not elicit a response? If there is love in this heart, the saying goes, then there is love in that heart. For one hand clasps not without the other. How seductive, and how wrong. For why trap what is already trapped? It is only in flight that we know the freedom of a bird. These were my idle thoughts on a walk with Dominic after the wedding. Thoughts concealed by my soft smile at his protestations and expectations, for Dominic had developed the habit of expectation. And this being a light, feather-soft day, and our being hidden on the other side of the lake, his attempts at seduction were successful. His expectations were fulfilled. My decision, I allowed, I deemed. It was essential with Dominic to keep a distance. I knew it. He did not. I watched through shuttered eyes his disintegration, and into the after minutes, while his body resembled itself, I dreamed a little dream of Elizabeth and Hubert, their conjunction, in holy matrimony. And again I felt no pain. Dominic whispered words of marriage again into my closed heart. With a sigh of irritation I left my thoughts. I planted doubt, and then its cruel cousin hope, in his heart. But not rejection. I had chosen to lay down my head on the quilted heart of a hosta, crushing it. I felt no guilt. Nature, after all, has never loved us back. We two walked back to Lexington, its guests now gone. A liar and her lad, with his clever modish face, his straw-colored hair endlessly flopping into his glasses, his long body and all its lines that did not entrance me. We sat around the table with my mother and father. We ate tiny grilled fish, then cold chicken covered in pale lemon cream and decorated with black olives, shaped into hearts. The lilies on the table, some with the closed heads of snakes, gently opened during dinner. Predator turned victim. I drank red wine and wondered idly what Elizabeth and Hubert were doing. Now, exactly now. In my mind's eye, I wandered up and down her familiar body. I tried to imagine it with Hubert's eye, and thought of that secret event for which we find private places, hidden rooms, or darkness, so that no one else will see the particular way men and women become one. Men thrusting blindly upwards through the same passage that he once blindly traveled down into the world, believing that he brings pleasure where once there had been pain. But still it leads to defeat, for from that sweetness come the pain and blood again, as down the passage the cranium pushes through bone again, and never once does God ask us for forgiveness. The red wine in my stomach sickened me, and idiotically shocked I thought of Elizabeth's pregnant, in birth, a mother. They will be very happy together, my father spoke. Is that an order? I asked. Ruth, dear, it's simply my assessment. Based, dear father, on what exactly? On my knowledge that a man would be foolish indeed not to be happy with Elizabeth. Ah, she has a secret formula, does she? Perhaps when she returns from Greece she can explain it to Dominic. Then he can create a mathematical formula for happiness and become famous. The Dominic-Garton Principle of Happiness in Marriage, based on the Ashbridge-Bathurst model. First discovered in Greek archipelago while the couple were on honeymoon. Before my father could voice his disapproval, I blew him a kiss and said, It's a joke, father. A joke. Of course they'll be gloriously happy together. And you're right. What man could fail to love Elizabeth? My father and mother smiled at each other in uncertain relief. And what man could fail to be happy with you, Ruth? Dominic blew me a kiss. Ah, Dominic, my only fan. I do not see myself built for happiness. It's almost an alien concept to me. What nonsense, Ruth. What utter nonsense, my father said. Nonsense only to you, father. It makes sense to me. You've had a wonderfully happy life so far. Don't be so careless of it. Let's look at the facts. My father and I had often engaged in this semi-banter. It was our own language barrier. It had a certain style, specific rules, and achieved the overall objective, non-communication. An essential between adult child and parent. His legal training naturally led him to believe that a question-and-answer technique was the road to the truth. He always forgot that I was not under oath. I'm going back to the flat tonight. Dominic rose to go. I have an early lecture in the morning. Elizabeth mentioned last week that she is going to keep her studio, my mother said. Yes, she's decided to go on painting there. Hubert's flat is too small, replied Dominic. Dominic lived in the same block of flats as Elizabeth, a mathematician with an artist's studio flat. This gave him, he believed, a bohemian air he rather longed for. His was an intelligence trapped within the wrong temperament. But such was his intelligence, and so quickly had it been recognized and rewarded by schools and universities, that the wonder kind never had a chance. He was later so loaded down with academic achievement that he was forced to succumb, and he became his talent, almost to the same degree as he became English. His parents were American. His father, like Dominic, was a noted mathematician. His mother, after a number of years at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had become a senior consultant to McKinsey. During a carefully planned mutual assignment to London, he to the London School of Economics, she to the London office of the parent company, Dominic attended Westminster School. There he fell in love with England, and with all things English. He believed his passion was reciprocated, a familiar blindness in Dominic. Later his parents returned to America. He decided on Trinity College, Cambridge, as opposed to Harvard. There he began to accept what he had only half understood at Westminster, that his passionate seriousness about his work needed to be leavened by irony, and that in polite society in England The sciences were rarely to be mentioned. A minor flirtation with the arts was much more laudable. I met him at a little party Elizabeth had given a few years previously. As visits to his flats would provide me with a perfect lookout, I encouraged his interest. My suggestion of Dominic, in both strategy and tactics, was so subtly planned and executed that in the moment of possession it was his face which portrayed triumph. The increasing urgency of his deepening love for me was only complication in the otherwise perfect scenario. Therefore, before Dominic, there had, of course, been Min. There was an early boyfriend of Elizabeth's, a Mexican painter who, to my disappointment, I found this out too late, she had rejected. Then there was a liaison with a wholly unsuitable member of the aristocracy who was playing with the idea of being an artist. That romance had allowed me a stolen weekend in Paris, and that side of himself, which I guess he had kept well hidden from Elizabeth, was allowed full reign. An interesting and educational 2 days. The son of a Lexington neighbor proved a much duller conquest. His guilt at his betrayal of Elizabeth was so excessive as to be almost amusing. I looked at Dominic, Ruth's dedicated lover, never Elizabeth's. A decision to keep her studio surprised me. Elizabeth hadn't told me, perhaps believing it to be of no consequence. But it was of great consequence for Dominic. I sighed. For the immediate future, at least. It rather seemed as if Dominic and our relationship would survive. "Well, you two, you couple." Hubert smiled. He and Elizabeth, Dominic and I, were having a welcome home dinner at a restaurant close to their home. Elizabeth was not a cook. Bronzed, hair bleached, dressed in cream silk shirt and dark brown skirt, Elizabeth talked of Greece. Each word was shot through with love. She spoke of color with her pretty painter's eye, and I felt sure that inevitably she had entered her Greek period. Its blue-green lightness and celestial white would be broken only by some cascade of blushing pink petals, or perhaps, for dramatic contrast, a black-clothed peasant would ride or stride his or her way across the canvas. "Well, Madame et Monsieur Hubert Bathurst, newlywed, happily married, give us a definition of married happiness." Dominic was always searching for definitions. "It does not exist," Hubert said. Elizabeth looked shocked. "Marriage has no intrinsic happiness. Happiness is to be with the one, and to be the only one for the other. With or without marriage?" "Yes. Though the ease and convenience and pleasure of formal togetherness is a delightful thing, a wise thing, so marriage is a wise happiness. No? Your English is improving dramatically." "Thank you, Ruth," he smiled at me. Hubert's English is only a little stilted when he spoke first. Only a little stilted when he first meets people. He is shy, Elizabeth spoke. "Shy?" "Only a little," I replied. "Wise happiness. I really like that. You both, I hope, will have years and years of wise happiness." Dominic raised his glass. "To wise happiness, the happiness of Elizabeth and Hubert." We all went back to Hubert's flat, now their home, for coffee. It was a masculine flat, heavy, dark woods, paisley-patterned curtains, leather sofas, conventional though elegant, the handsome abode of a handsome man. He looked at me looking at the flat. "We'll move to Paris in a couple of years." It seemed pointless to set about furnishing a new home. "Is that definite?" Dominic asked. I was still digesting the thought of separation. "Oh, yes," replied Hubert. "That's why I'll continue to paint in my studio until we go to Paris," Elizabeth added. "Hubert assures me that I will have a studio high at the top of the house." I envisioned a new Paris period of rooftops, gray-slated. Which cliché would she pick? Wise happiness was, I felt, going to be very boring, but if I were Elizabeth, what would I find with Hubert? If I were Elizabeth? Well, we must leave you two. It's a joy to see you back again, so harmonious. I'm always searching for mathematical harmonies. Their beauty would astound you. The Greeks believed they were the essence of goodness, you know. Why, Dominic, I've never heard you speak so romantically about your work before. No, Ruth, perhaps I'm afraid of mockery. He did not say whose. Love's a miracle, a way of seeing someone, suffused by light. It's like my painting, my unfashionable, light-filled painting. Love's an extra dimension to sight. It gives a light that only the loved one seems to have, and only the lover sees. That's how I see Hubert. Elizabeth turned away at the end of her extraordinary little speech, a speech quite out of character. In her thin, fine face there was a frightening fierceness. Had I, through my astonishment, betrayed my hatred? Had she run for cover? Previously my life was a little spoiled and selfish. Elizabeth had made me better. Hubert, handsome, happy, and humble. And what is the outward sign of this improvement? I tried to sound mocking. There's no outward sign, Ruth, but I have changed. For example, I mock less. I had been put in my place. Well, Hubert, your English has certainly improved. No problem with nuance anymore, he laughed. Oh, Ruth, you too will melt. Dominic winced at this implication that he was ineffective in thawing my coldness. Sensitive as ever, Elizabeth noticed. Dominic has, I think, already started the process. Now, I'll be very French and give you 2 kisses and say au revoir. The kisses were perfunctory. We waved goodbye and left. The less harmonious couple. Is it possible to seduce a happily married man in the early days of his marriage, particularly a man who sees in his new wife qualities that have meant little to him before? The ordinary strategies would most certainly not work. Swimming too close to him in the discreetly hidden pool at Lexington, or over-enthusiastically leaning forward in a low-cut gown, which I rarely wore anyway. Such full frontal assaults were not for such as he. At a celebration dinner for my parents' anniversary, I wore a perfect curve of dark red velvet. Though it served to emphasize the ripeness of my body, I knew the effect to be of little interest, from the lack of tension in his open, smiling response, and to be truthful, I too disdained the slight vulgarity of my display. No, Elizabeth had not married a fool, and the light she saw around him allowed no access. Slowly I began to accept that, with Hubert, perhaps, only patient malevolence might work. There was a day at Lexington. We sat together in the garden, alone for some reason, and I tried to hold him with my eyes. I moved suddenly closer to him. He looked at me, coldly, knowingly. Then he stood up. I think I can see Elizabeth. Excuse me, Ruth. Was there an ambivalence in the words? Or have I been given a signal? Keep a distance? Had he absorbed me, Ruth? Or simply recognized my purpose? Sometime after that, I suffered a mild illness. When I left the hospital, I felt weary, and as Dominic persisted with his entreaties, I thought of surrender. To him, in marriage, why not? My secret life, with its thrilling, labyrinthian ways, and fierce cacophony of voices, my own surface voice, its contradictory echo, and the imagined voice of my victim, enthralled but increasingly weakened me. My work, never the center, became more and more peripheral. Making my way in publishing was neither necessary to me financially, nor of profound interest to me intellectually. I had proved to myself that I had the ability and the discipline to succeed in my chosen field. My life's ambition, however, lay elsewhere, and Dominic was, in his way, appealing. I enjoyed his adoration. He was totally within my control. The idea, once considered, grew more powerful, and Dominic, sensing victory, made a sudden assault of great intensity. Flattered and not a little exhausted, I succumbed. We were married quietly in London. Lexington had already had its triumphant wedding day. I did not want to be the second bride. But later I was again preempted. Elizabeth became pregnant. Her son, Stephen, born after a cesarean section, brought extraordinary joy to both Elizabeth and Hubert. Their flat was reorganized for the new baby, and Hubert's return to Paris was postponed. The proud father, the happy husband, remained pure. And Stephen became a catalyst for William, who was born almost 2 years later by easy vaginal delivery, a son for me and for Dominic. Now Dominic had everything he wanted, the woman he loved, and a son. Is it any wonder that I sometimes sought to punish him? I was, however, a good mother, a dedicated mother. When I looked at William, I ceased to think. I discovered in myself a desire to worship porcelain perfection, bathed by me, and then dressed again. The impenetrable mystery of cries and silences, the eyes that gazed back in flat knowingness. Later, a tough, sturdy mobility, moving towards me, then old sounds made new, mostly for me. Surely it should have been enough, for me, for anyone. But then it never has been. When the maternity nurse left, everything to do with William was done by me. Dominic was both surprised and elated by this. I knew my love for William entranced him, so there was solace for Dominic. I kept a balance for him. It seemed only fair. Having bought the adjacent studio flat with great care to maintain his beloved harmony of dimensions, Dominic created a space of order and symmetry for his beautiful wife and child. Against a backdrop of white walls, he placed in careful patterns a geometry of furniture, at angles touching cream chaise lounges, a circle of black chairs, a perfect rectangle of low wooden tables with wrought iron legs, old Italian tables, he told me. An antique globe dominated one end of the living room, and a magnificent telescope stood at the other. William's room was small, buttercup yellow. On his bed, impossibly colored green cows and shepherds seemed to chase each other through a yellow field of flowers. He found them soothing, and grasped his soft cover to him like a rag-doll lover, one who offers no resistance. Our bedroom was a subtle contrast of blues and navy. Dominic created, behind a hidden door, I have a key, a long walk-in dressing room for me. Along one side, on racks, were the clothes that wrapped around the body Dominic adored, my shoes in neat color-coded battalions. On open shelves, my carefully folded sweaters sat softly, one on top of the other, an organized rainbow of black and cream and red. A small dressing table contained a pretty array of creams and powders. Less attractive objects remained in their drawers. It was there, in this narrow, dark room, that I kept the items belonging to Elizabeth. The high heels, black patent, 2 silk slips, one olive green, one black, to which I had made some alterations to suit the different requirements of my body. Stockings, a hairbrush, a new acquisition. A beret, also new. I was aware of the sexual connotations of many of these items and of the purpose to which I might put them. However, even these most intimate... I hate when they separate words with like a dash. It really annoys me. Accoutrements did not imply a lust for Elizabeth's body. No, I was much more demanding. Elizabeth never seemed to miss these items. Would you? Such small things, over years? Initially, in the early years of my marriage, I was very secretive, hiding them under layers of clothes or placing them with care at the back of my drawers. But as time passed, my dressing room became more and more my private domain, never to be invaded. I relaxed. These items were not for normal wear. They were for secret times. Times when I gazed in fascination at my Elizabeth-decorated body and walked around my dark kingdom in a kind of trance. The pattern of my early relationship with Dominic continued in marriage. I became increasingly fascinated by my power over him. It was, I knew, a small achievement, a small art. But then I was never ambitious. Few people are. Perhaps there is in us some inherited ancient knowledge. The majority do not desire the world, knowing on some primitive level that it disappoints. They are quite content to let the blind few pursue their path to wisdom, and to watch those trapped by genius forced to sacrifice themselves, and those trapped by talent to emulate them. Much better to be in the audience, watching the actors find the surprise ending. We're already at chapter 10. Perhaps I was numbed by motherhood. I moved through time as though in a fog, and 5 years slumbered on the telephone call. A call to Lexington, where Elizabeth and I, our husbands both away on business, had decided to spend the weekend. I took the call. I listened, then I carefully put down the receiver. I stayed for a long time alone in the sitting room, then finally, and very slowly, I went to find her. She was cutting roses in the garden. She turned and saw my face. Something told her to run away from me. From the terrace, she ran across the lawn, half walking, half running through the parkland. She stumbled through the bushes and staggered on and on towards the lake, trying to escape from the knowledge I had, the knowledge I would bring to her, when I caught her, or when she stopped, which would be sooner. It was a question of courage, hers. And of course, finally, magnificent, she turned to me. I whispered the words, "No, no," she screamed, and she fell, the body's truth in the great moments of life. Of all those who could have brought her such a truth, I was the messenger, selected by chance. Dominic's trip to California, my parents' visit to London. I stood and watched her as the knowledge wound itself around her. As I listened as she made the high, thin sounds of a woman mourning, razor-sharp sounds that cut the air. And then, on her knees still, she beat the ground for him. But I resisted, or if it softened at all, it was only to receive him later. She was defeated, a defeat so instant, so total, that her past life died in a second, and her new one came screamingly alive. She was stunned alive by an expert, and death had taken her protection away. I saw it all in a second's pitiless pity. Then I knelt beside her and comforted the tragic widow. And I thought that I knew would never break them now, or ever know her through Hubert. In a sense, I had been robbed of my prey. Yeah, that's the way to look at it. Then again, I guess she does hate her sister. We bury with many different emotions, rarely with imitations of mortality. Buried is the ultimate separation of them and us. As others' lives are often only dreams to us, so also others' death. Only occasionally is there agony, and it was Elizabeth's that day. Grief swelled her face as though all the fluids of the body, lymph and blood, were surging in a wave of revolt, crashing against the rocks and bone structure. Her eyes, however, remained abnormally still. It seemed excessive to me, but I could feel its power. I kept my distance. I thought of a year hence, or perhaps 5 years, Hubert, a dreamy ghost of a handsome husband, a memory to be respected by the second husband, for he would most assuredly arrive from somewhere in the future, to live the life Hubert had lost. Would it make a difference to her in 5 years' time? After the Latin Mass and the searing Dies Irae, Elizabeth, my father's hand firmly on her elbow, followed immediately by Hubert's parents, tall, trembling, not touching each other, led the procession down the aisle of the 17th century chapel in Tours. I walked profoundly calm beside my weeping mother. Dominic was not with me. He had sensibly and kindly taken a bewildered Stephen and an excited William to friends in Scotland. The English mourners whispered as they followed the cortege to the small cemetery where Hubert was to join his ancestors. Modern plague car crashes. Biggest killer of men under. No one else was killed. That was a mercy. It took hours to get him out. He was terribly broken. Everything. The Frenchman searched for words. Everything broken, except the eyes, which of course they closed. Elizabeth allowed herself to be led from the cemetery and sat alone in total silence on the flight back to London. She had declined to attend the family gathering at Les Cyprès, the Bathurst chateau. Hunched in the back of the car during the drive to Lexington, she neither moved nor spoke. When we arrived, she went straight to her rooms. Silently, fiercely, she motioned us to leave, and she stayed there, hour after hour, then day after day, in silence. No speech, no sound of any kind was allowed. When we entered with food or tried to speak to her about a doctor, about help, she looked at us as though our words were causing physical agony. My parents grew more and more distraught at her muteness. I tried to calm them. I knew Elizabeth would recover. She would see it as her duty, to Stephen, her son, a duty of care, a duty not to cause further suffering to people who had been so full of love for her. Elizabeth even suffered selflessly. After 4 days we heard a scream, long and high, and then another and another. We raced towards her rooms. When we reached her, she was frantically trying to close the window. I have lost him. He's gone. Just now. He wanted to go. He wouldn't stay. I couldn't hold him. I had him in here. She hugged herself, shaking violently. Come back, Hubert. Come back. Please, please, Hubert, come back. She turned to us, desperate. I didn't want to wake him. He was so quiet. He was lying asleep in me. I was afraid you would wake him. When you came to talk to me, afraid that he would waken and he would go. Oh, Hubert, he has just left me. He fought his way out of me. I am empty, Hubert. I'm empty. We stood there, petrified, made into stone by her pain, unwilling, frightened witness to extremis. Later, she agreed to have the family doctor visit her. They remained together, quietly talking for hours. When he emerged, she told us she would sleep, possibly for days, on and off, and she did. It was finally over. And that's where we're gonna stop for today. Tell me what you think about that part of the book, and I will see you all next time. Bye, guys.